I never imagined a $3 ceramic gnome would start a neighborhood war. It began with a single red-hatted little guy I placed beside my mailbox. Nothing flashy, just a harmless garden gnome holding a tiny lantern. He made me smile every time I pulled into the driveway. By the next morning, he was in pieces. Not tipped over. Not cracked. Smashed. His head separated clean from his body, like someone had deliberately stomped on him. At first, I blamed raccoons. Or maybe a careless delivery driver. I cleaned up the shards, shrugged it off, and bought another one. This time, I chose a fisherman gnome with a little blue coat. I positioned him closer to my porch where the security camera could see the walkway. 2 days later, broken again. But this time, something was different. He wasn't just smashed. He was moved, dragged, placed deliberately in the middle of my driveway, like a message. That's when I knew. This wasn't random. This was personal. And in my neighborhood, personal usually traced back to one person. The HOA's self-appointed queen, Karen. She had already tried to fine me for excessively cheerful lawn decor. Apparently, 2 gnomes were inconsistent with community aesthetic guidelines. I had read the covenants 3 times. There was nothing about gnomes. Nothing about figurines. Nothing about lawn art at all. Still, she left violation notices taped dramatically to my door. Remove immediately. I didn't. Instead, I added a 3rd gnome. This one had sunglasses and a tiny sign that read, "Smile." It lasted exactly 6 hours. When I came home from work, there were ceramic crumbs glittering in the grass like confetti from a very bitter parade. That's when my irritation turned into resolve. Because here's the thing about bullies, they escalate when they think you'll fold. And I don't fold. That evening, I reviewed my camera footage. At 2:14 p.m., right after the school bus passed, a familiar white SUV rolled slowly to a stop in front of my house. The driver door opened. Out stepped Karen. Big sunglasses. Clipboard tucked under her arm. That stiff, purposeful march like she was enforcing federal law instead of arguing about mulch colors. She looked around, walked straight up my path, bent down, picked up the gnome, and smashed it against the brick column of my porch. Then she calmly got back in her SUV and drove off. No hesitation. No guilt. Like she had just swatted a fly. I replayed it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Crystal clear. Timestamped. Zoomed in. Her face. Her car. Her license plate. All of it. I leaned back in my chair and laughed. Not because it was funny, but because she had no idea what she had just handed me. Evidence. The next morning, she was at my door before 9 a.m. Another violation notice. This time claiming I was creating a hostile visual environment. Hostile. With gnomes. I opened the door slowly, holding the printed still frame from my camera. Her smile faded the moment she saw the photo. "You might want to be careful about touching property that isn't yours," I said calmly. She straightened up immediately. "I have no idea what you're implying." I handed her the second photo. Her mid-swing. Ceramic fragments frozen in the air. Her lips tightened. "That's edited," she snapped. "Sure," I said. "So, is the video?" For a split second, I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not guilt. Not embarrassment. Fear. But it vanished just as quickly. "You shouldn't have those ridiculous statues out in the first place," she hissed. "They lower property values." "They cost $3, I replied. "Relax." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're going to remove them?" "No," I said simply. The silence stretched between us like a pulled wire. She gave me a long, icy stare, then turned sharply and walked back to her SUV. I watched her leave. And that's when the idea hit me. If she thought 3 tiny gnomes were a problem, what would she do about one that couldn't be smashed? One that couldn't be ignored. One that followed every single HOA rule perfectly, but made her absolutely furious. By the end of that week, I wasn't shopping in the garden aisle anymore. I was calling a contractor. And Karen had no idea what was coming. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you subscribe now because what happened next turned a petty HOA feud into something the entire neighborhood still talks about. By Friday morning, I had blueprints. Not for a house. Not for a shed. For a gnome. A 12-foot tall, reinforced, HOA compliant, absolutely immovable garden gnome. I wasn't going to break rules. That was the beauty of it. I spent hours combing through the HOA covenants. Landscaping restrictions? None on decorative statuary, as long as it wasn't commercial signage or temporary structures. Height restrictions? Only applied to fences. Permanent lawn fixtures? Allowed. As long as they were aesthetic enhancements. Perfect. I hired a local sculptor who specialized in custom fiberglass installations. When I told him what I wanted, he blinked twice and said, "You're serious?" Completely. We designed him with exaggerated detail, bright red hat, flowing white beard, arms crossed confidently over a round belly. And instead of a lantern, he held a small plaque that read, "Property Value Guardian." Subtle. But not really. The base would be concrete, 4 feet deep into the ground. Steel rebar reinforcement. Anchored like a mailbox in hurricane country. No smashing this one. No dragging it into the driveway. No accidents. The installation was scheduled for the following Wednesday. I didn't tell anyone. Not even my closest neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, who had quietly admitted he didn't mind the little guys. On installation day, the flatbed truck arrived at 7:30 a.m. It took 3 workers, a small crane, and half the street blocking off to lower the giant gnome into place. I'll never forget the moment it stood upright. 12 glorious feet of ceramic-inspired defiance towering over my front yard. From the street, you couldn't miss it. It didn't just sit there. It dominated. By 8:05 a.m., curtains were twitching all down the block. At 8:12 a.m., Karen's white SUV screeched to a halt in front of my house. She got out so fast, she didn't even close her door. She just stood there, staring, her mouth slightly open, hands on hips. It was magnificent. She marched up my walkway like a general approaching a battlefield. "What," she demanded, "is that?" I stepped onto the porch calmly. "An aesthetic enhancement. You can't put that here." "Show me where it says I can't." Her face flushed a dangerous shade of red. "It's disruptive. It's art. It's obscene. It's a gnome." The silence that followed was almost musical. She whipped out her phone and started taking pictures. "Emergency HOA meeting," she muttered. "Immediately." I smiled. "I'll be there." Within 24 hours, every homeowner received an email labeled, "Urgent Community Violation Hearing." The subject line might as well have said, "Attack of the Giant Gnome." That evening, the clubhouse was packed. I brought printed copies of the bylaws. Highlighted. Tabbed. Indexed. Karen opened the meeting with dramatic flair. "This installation," she began, pointing to a blown-up photo of my yard, "is a blatant disregard for community standards." "Which standard?" I asked calmly. She flipped through papers. Cleared her throat. Stalled. "Section 8, she said vaguely. I stood up. Section 8 addresses mailbox paint colors. A few neighbors snorted. Her jaw tightened. "It creates visual hostility." "Show me the clause," I repeated. She couldn't, because it didn't exist. Another board member leaned toward her and whispered something urgently. She waved him off. Then came the part she didn't expect. Mr. Alvarez raised his hand. "I like it," he said plainly. Silence. "It's cheerful," he added. "Better than another beige yard." A woman near the back nodded. "My kids think it's hilarious." Someone else muttered, "At least it's not political signs." The energy in the room shifted. Karen felt it. I could see it in the way her shoulders stiffened. She had expected outrage. She got amusement. She tried one last angle. "It lowers property values." I slid a printed document across the table. A recent appraisal from a real estate friend showing 0 statistical impact from decorative lawn fixtures. She didn't even look at it. The vote was forced. 5 board members. 3 voted no violation. 2 abstained. Motion denied. Meeting adjourned. Karen didn't speak to me, as everyone filtered out. But as I passed her in the hallway, she leaned in and whispered, "This isn't over." I believed her, because bullies rarely stop when they lose. They look for another angle. And over the next week, she found one. Karen didn't come after the gnome. She came after everything around it. It started small. A landscaping compliance notice, taped to my mailbox claiming my hedges were 1 inch too tall. Then another letter about excessive foot traffic wear on my lawn. Then a warning that my driveway had visible surface discoloration. The timing wasn't subtle. Every notice was dated within days of the HOA vote. Every complaint was signed by Karen. And every one of them was technically debatable. Not clear violations. Not obvious nonsense. Just gray area harassment. I handled them the same way I handled the gnome situation. Documentation. Photos with timestamps. Certified responses. Measure hedge trimming to the exact inch. Pressure washed driveway within 48 hours. Reseeded the small patch of lawn she'd circled in red. I gave her nothing, and that seemed to bother her more than if I'd argued. But then something changed. One Saturday morning, I stepped outside with coffee in hand and froze. The giant gnome's face had been splattered with neon green paint. Not a lot, just enough to ruin it. It dripped down the beard like toxic slime. And written across the red hat in thick black marker were 2 words. Eyesore trash. My stomach dropped. For a second, I just stood there. Because this wasn't HOA paperwork anymore. This was vandalism. And I knew exactly who wanted it gone. But wanting something and proving something are 2 different things. I walked slowly around the base. The concrete was untouched. No structural damage. Just surface paint. Sloppy. Rushed. Whoever did it didn't expect the surface to be sealed. Because I had paid extra for industrial-grade weatherproof coating. The paint hadn't absorbed. It sat on top. Cleanable. I didn't call Karen. I didn't call the HOA. I called the police. When the officer arrived, he took one look and said, "Well, that's new." I showed him the previous complaint notices. The emergency HOA meeting documentation. The timeline. He nodded. "Any cameras?" I smiled. "Yes." 2 weeks earlier, right after Karen's whispered, "This isn't over," I had installed a small, discreet security camera in the 2nd-story window facing the yard. Motion activated. Night vision. Cloud storage. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. The officer and I stepped inside. I pulled up the footage from 2:17 a.m. And there it was. A hooded figure creeping into my yard. They approached cautiously. Looked around twice. Then sprayed. It took less than 40 seconds. When the figure turned slightly under the porch light, the hood shifted. Just enough. Blonde hair. Distinctive white SUV parked down the street with headlights off. License plate partially visible. The officer leaned closer to the screen. "You know who that is?" "I have a very strong suspicion." He nodded slowly. "Don't touch anything. We'll handle it." By Monday morning, the neighborhood buzzed like a beehive. Word travels fast when patrol cars park outside an HOA president's house. Karen's door was answered by 2 uniformed officers. They weren't aggressive. They were calm. Professional. But calm can be scarier than shouting. I watched from my kitchen window as she gestured wildly, hands flailing, pointing down the street toward my house, then at her own chest, then shaking her head over and over. About 20 minutes later, one officer walked back to his car. The other stayed. When they finally left, Karen stood frozen in her driveway. Neighbors were watching now. Not hiding behind curtains. Openly watching.
She spotted me.
Our eyes locked. This time there was no fire in hers. No fury.
Just something else. Worry.
That afternoon, I received an email from the HOA board, not Karen. Subject line: Temporary administrative adjustment. Karen was stepping down pending internal review. Effective immediately. The board cited personal conduct concerns. Interesting wording. The gnome was professionally cleaned the next day. Insurance covered it. No permanent damage. But something in the neighborhood had shifted. People started waving at me more, stopping to take selfies with the giant gnome. Kids asked their parents if they could see the famous statue. And, for the first time since moving here, Karen wasn't knocking on my door. She wasn't sending notices. She wasn't whispering threats. But bullies don't disappear quietly. They regroup. And, 2 weeks later, I learned she'd been planning something much bigger than paint. If Karen had simply accepted the police visit and retreated quietly into obscurity, this story would have ended with a giant fiberglass gnome and a bruised ego. But that's not how people like her operate. 2 weeks after she temporarily stepped down, I received a certified letter from an attorney's office. Not the HOA's general counsel, a private firm. The letter claimed my giant gnome constituted a private nuisance and intentional infliction of aesthetic distress. I read that line 3 times. Aesthetic distress. Apparently, the statue caused her mental anguish and interfered with her peaceful enjoyment of her property. The demand? Immediate removal, plus reimbursement for emotional damages. I laughed.
Then I stopped laughing.
Because this wasn't just bluster. It was escalation. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, an old college friend who now specialized in property disputes. Within an hour, he called me. "Let me guess," he said. "This is about the 12-foot lawn wizard." "Gnome," I corrected.
He sighed.
"Of course it is." He read the letter aloud, pausing occasionally to chuckle. "She's fishing," he said finally. "Trying to scare you into backing down. Is there any chance she wins?" "Not unless judges start ruling based on hurt feelings." Still, he suggested we respond formally. Not aggressively. Professionally. We included HOA bylaws confirming compliance, police report from the vandalism incident, proof of installation permits, documentation of prior harassment, and then one additional detail Karen didn't know about. When she vandalized the gnome, the police had issued her a formal citation. It hadn't been publicized, but it was real. If she pushed this into court, that incident would become part of the record. And motive matters. 3 days after our response was delivered, something strange happened. I got a call from one of the other HOA board members. Not Karen. Not her allies. A quiet accountant named Denise who rarely spoke during meetings. "Can we talk?" she asked. We met at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood. She looked tired. Embarrassed. "I didn't know she was doing this," Denise said. "The attorney letter? She didn't run that by the board." "Isn't she suspended?" I asked. "She still has access to community funds." That made me sit up straighter. Denise lowered her voice. She used HOA money to hire that attorney. Now, we were no longer talking about garden decor. We were talking about misuse of funds. And homeowners don't take kindly to that. Denise explained that several residents had started asking questions after seeing police at Karen's house. The board had been reviewing financial records quietly. Retainer payments. Legal consultation fees. Expenses labeled vaguely as community enforcement. All tied to one issue. My gnome. "She thought if she could scare you into removing it," Denise said, "no one would dig deeper." That was her mistake. Because once people start digging, they don't stop at one hole. Within a week, an emergency board audit was announced. This time, Karen didn't send the email.
Denise did.
Subject line: Financial Transparency Review. The meeting turnout was bigger than the one about my visual hostility. Spreadsheets were projected onto the clubhouse wall. Line items highlighted. Dates circled. Total amount spent pursuing me? Just under $18,000. Gasps filled the room. One neighbor stood up immediately. "You spent $18,000 because you didn't like a lawn ornament?" Karen tried to argue it was about community preservation. But the numbers didn't lie. And neither did the police report. Someone asked directly about the vandalism citation. She went pale. Another homeowner demanded reimbursement. Then another. Then another. The mood shifted from annoyance to outrage. Because it wasn't about a gnome anymore. It was about trust. About money. About authority abused for personal grudges. The board called for a vote that night. Not on my statue. On her position. Removal required a majority of homeowners present. Hands went up across the room. Not hesitantly. Not slowly.
Decisively.
The vote passed. Karen was officially removed as HOA president. Effective immediately. She left before the meeting ended. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't make eye contact. Just walked out while 30 neighbors watched. The next morning, something unexpected happened. A small bouquet of flowers appeared at the base of the giant gnome. No note. Just flowers. By afternoon, someone added a tiny sign that read, "Long live the Guardian." I didn't put it there. I didn't have to. But just when I thought the saga was finally over, Karen made one last move. And this one, she would regret forever. You'd think losing her position, facing public embarrassment, and nearly triggering a financial investigation would have been enough. It wasn't. Karen moved out 3 months later. Not dramatically. No moving truck spectacle. No tearful goodbye. Just a quiet for sale sign planted in her yard. But before she left, she tried one final maneuver. She filed a complaint with the city's zoning department claiming my giant gnome violated height restrictions for residential accessory structures. Accessory structure. Apparently, my fiberglass garden guardian had evolved into architecture. This time, I didn't panic. Because I had learned something valuable over the past few months. Paperwork beats tantrums. The city inspector arrived on a Tuesday morning.
Clipboard.
Laser measuring tool. Professional indifference. He walked around the gnome slowly. Measured from base to hat tip. Checked the permit I had secured before installation.
Yes.
I had pulled a permit. Mostly because I knew Karen would escalate eventually. Height limit for decorative lawn installations? 12 feet. My gnome? 11 feet, 8 inches. The inspector looked at me, then at the statue, then back at his clipboard. You cut it close, he said. Very intentional, I replied. He smiled faintly.
Complaint dismissed.
Officially documented. And because it was Karen's name on the complaint form, that dismissal became part of public record. When her house finally sold, it didn't go for asking price. Rumors travel. So, do court filings. Prospective buyers ask questions. Especially in HOA neighborhoods. By the time she left, she wasn't the feared enforcer of community standards anymore. She was the former president removed after misusing funds and filing failed complaints over a garden ornament. Meanwhile, something strange had happened in the neighborhood. The giant gnome stopped being controversial. It became symbolic. Kids named it Sir Sprinkles. Someone knit a seasonal scarf for it in winter. At Halloween, neighbors left mini pumpkins at its feet. At Christmas, I wrapped soft white lights around the hat. And every time I added something new, I checked the bylaws first. Because compliance, when done strategically, is powerful. The new HOA board adopted a transparency policy. Monthly financial summaries. Open meetings. Clear voting procedures. Denise became president. Quiet. Methodical.
Fair.
No more surprise violation letters. No more personal vendettas disguised as community standards. And here's the part that surprised me most. Property values went up. Turns out buyers appreciate neighborhoods without power-hungry chaos. One afternoon about a year later, I was trimming hedges, precisely to regulation height, when a moving truck pulled up across the street. New neighbors. A young couple with a toddler. The little girl pointed immediately at the giant gnome. Eyes wide. Mommy. Big fairy. I couldn't help laughing. Her parents walked over to introduce themselves. I hope that thing isn't controversial, the husband said cautiously. Only if you hate fun, I replied.
He grinned.
Then we're good. A week later, they placed a small ceramic gnome near their mailbox. Then another neighbor added one. Then another. It wasn't coordinated. It just happened. Within months, tiny gnomes dotted the neighborhood like cheerful little rebels. Nothing massive. Nothing disruptive. Just subtle reminders. Authority works best when it serves people, not when it tries to control them. As for my original garden gnomes, the little ones Karen smashed, I kept the broken pieces. Not out of spite, out of memory, because this was never really about lawn decor. It was about standing your ground calmly, documenting everything, and understanding that bullies rely on intimidation more than rules. The giant gnome still stands today. 11 feet, 8 inches of fiberglass persistence. And every now and then, when I see someone stop to take a photo beside it, I think about that first shattered gnome in the dirt, and how close I came to just removing everything to avoid conflict. I'm glad I didn't, because sometimes the most powerful statement isn't loud. It's compliant, measured, and just 2 inches under the legal limit.